Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and start. We're going to have the panelists introduce themselves, talk briefly about their background. I'm Mitch Ziegler. Just to give you why this happened, I was talking to Adriana in my capacity as California JEA director, and she's the SCJEA president. And I was so concerned and feeling kind of impotent about the ability to act in this time as an educator. And even though I'm retired, it's still something that's really important to me. I jokingly call this getting out of my fetal position after the election. But I realize, in a time period where local news is dying in so many important ways, student reporters are going to have to step up. But the danger, of course, on this particular topic revolves around issues of anonymity, not doing any harm. And I just think these are incredibly important. By the way, I was the advisor at Redondo Union High School for 31 years. I retired in June of 21, fully tired and figuring out new ways of getting myself into trouble, which is a good thing. And we can just kind of go around. I guess that would be introduce themselves. Actually, Adriana, you should go next.
Yes, hi. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Adriana Chavira. I'm a journalism advisor in Los Angeles at Daniel Pearl Magnet High School. Before I went into teaching, I was a reporter for 10 years here in Los Angeles. And so definitely, this topic is, close to my heart and, definitely very important. And, as I'm a member of the Journalism Education Association, and we have a listserv on there. And you know, maybe about more than a month ago, advisors from across the country started asking questions about how to cover this. So then, we started, talking about, can we address this? And Mitch and I put this together, and with the help of the Student Press Law Center. Thank you, Mike and Josh, for helping us out with that. And I'm also a board member of the Student Press Law Center. And also, like Mitch mentioned, I am president of the Southern California Journalism Education Association, which covers from pretty much Santa Barbara down to San Diego. So we represent schools and journalism programs through in that area. All right, so Mike, do you want to go next and introduce yourself?
You bet. My name is Mike Hiestand. I am the senior legal counsel for the Student Press Law Center. For those of you that maybe haven't heard about the Student Press Law Center, you should. Let me just tell you real quickly. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around. This is actually our 50th year of being in business. And our whole reason for doing what we do is to provide free legal help to student journalists, both at the high school level, college level, even some middle schoolers once in a while. So my main job at the SPLC is to kind of manage our hotline. So we do have a free legal hotline where you can call and talk one-on-one with us. The website's chock full of information. In fact, I think we're just about to post a new guide on this topic to the website. But if you have more specific questions, please do reach out and use the hotline. We're happy to talk.
Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Castillo. I'm a reporter at the LA Times. I've covered immigration for really since the beginning of my career. It's been over a decade, and so at the LA Times for the last 8 years, the last 3 of which have been based out of DC, which is a little bit of a different perspective, point of view than covering it on the ground in California, but much closer to where the policymakers are and the policy that is or is not happening. So glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And Kathryn?
Hi, hi, I'm Kathryn Fu. I'm one of the editors-in-chief at Monta Vista's Estoque, so I'm based around Silicon Valley. I'm speaking here today because I recently did some reporting surrounding undocumented students within my own community, and I'm really excited to be talking to you guys a little bit more about my experience, but also the broader broader topic of journalism and its intersection with immigration.
Okay, and I just posted a link to one of Kathryn's stories that's online. I think it's a very strong piece, and it's kind of the basis for why Kathryn is here right now. So I thought we'd start with some questions for Kathryn, and if you wouldn't mind talking about what you were thinking about in terms of the story. I mean, your main source, as we read it, was someone who had graduated a while ago, and all the thinking you had to put into how to cover the topic of immigration at Monta Vista.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little context to where I live first. So, being in the Silicon Valley, I am based in a school that is primarily Asian, around 70% Asian. But it was still a very large topic within our school, just of discussion. And especially since Trump has come into office, there's just been a lot of discourse around it. And so, when we were talking amongst ourselves and pitching, we thought it was a really valuable topic to cover, especially because it often goes unnoticed in our school. Um, so we kind of started in that way, and going from there, um, I think the largest issue we had off the bat was obviously sourcing. So I think this is going to be an issue that comes up time and time again. But the issue of trust, especially with our student journalism, is something that has we've kind of grappled with when we've taken on this story. So my personal experience is that I reached out to a different school in our same district, which has a higher population of undocumented students. That would be Fremont High School. And our journalism teacher was kind of already familiar with their journalism teacher. So she kind of gave me the contact, and I reached out and I worked with their journalism teacher to reach out to other students. And I was met with a lot of no's very quickly off the bat. And we were ideally trying to find like a student source, someone my age who would also be willing to speak on this issue. But from every turn, students themselves, and especially young students or students my age in high school, didn't trust other high schoolers initially off the bat to do so. We ended up getting sourcing from a different adult on campus that had only recently graduated. And this adult, her name was, I'm so sorry, I'm blanking. Her name was Alejandra Flores. Yes, Alejandra Flores was so kind to talk to us, and she was a DACA recipient, meaning that while at the moment she was not undocumented, in her past, she grew up being undocumented throughout our same district, and so I was able to gauge a lot of insight from her.
So you said you weren't able to find any actual. Did you try to find current students?
Oh, definitely. We spent almost the first 2 to 3 weeks just asking around. We even, I think this is another thing that's going to come up very often throughout today, but is we even offered anonymity to our sources just so that they would be able to feel comfortable, and because we prioritize the safety of our sources above all else. And so even doing so it is like very obviously a very sensitive topic. And so working with the journalism teacher there, I even personally reached out to them. I assured them that like we promise like we will try our best to protect you as best as possible. It's just, like I said, a sensitive issue.
And in many ways, I'd say this is the whole purpose for this webinar.
Yeah.
And because the students are very qualified to do the reporting because they have context. But I believe there's a lot of fear on both for sources and for the students themselves. So, Adriana, you had that great question. Let's start off maybe explaining why student journalists should not be afraid of
Okay,
writing about
let me
these
backtrack.
policies.
Let me backtrack a
Okay.
little bit because I actually want to ask Andrea about this. So, how do you go about gaining trust of some of the sources, especially students? Because that's one of the big changes with the policy now is that ICE can go into schools, churches, hospitals. So, how do you go about gaining their trust, especially when some of them you may be contacted by phone as opposed to in person because you're in DC. So how do you go about that? What sort of tips can maybe students get? Because I mean, I know if I told my students, well, you're going to spend 3 weeks trying to get one contact, that might throw them out there like, well, that's a lot of work. So how would what sort of advice can you give?
Yeah, I haven't covered too many recent stories involving students directly. We have other really great reporters who are on our education team who have been taking the charge on that. But I have covered education in the past. I've certainly talked to high school students throughout my career. And it's hard. Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that, she had such a hard time finding somebody who was willing to talk. Um, One thing for me that has always helped is like reaching out to, I mean, you talked about reaching out to like the student journalism teacher, but reaching out to like community organizations and trying to find people that way. I mean, that might be a little bit too broad if you're looking for somebody within a particular school, but if there's like a community-based organization that's within the district and that works with undocumented students, I find that can help, like actually sitting down with community leaders and, like nonprofit organizers and advocates, and like having an in-person, one-on-one conversation with them so that they can sort of understand, who you are, and then be able to like vouch for you to the people that they serve. Another thing that helps is, especially after the first Trump administration, I started just offering people like, look, we don't need to have an interview off the bat. What if we just like talk? I can explain my story to you. I can explain what I'm working on. You have no like requirement. I'm not gonna like hold you to an interview. If we get to the end of the conversation and you say, yeah, you know what, I still don't really want to talk to you on the record, that's fine. But like at least I can then, sort of explain them and approach them from a place that is like more comfortable. So yeah, so that's where I actually now tend to approach most of the starts of my conversations is you're not beholden to anything, but let me just like explain what I'm trying to do. And at the end of our conversation, you can sort of like decide for yourself whether that's something that you're interested in or not.
Okay, very good. And this question is for both Mike and Andrea. So maybe you can explain why student journalists should not be afraid of writing about immigration. Because I think a lot of advisors across the country are probably concerned about their students tackling such an issue, because it is definitely very controversial, especially if in their areas they don't have many migrant populations. I know like my students, they've written about it, like, Kathryn school, they definitely have tackled it, but there's some who maybe are like on the fence or not sure. Cause I know some have contacted me and asked me for advice on that too. So why should student journalists tackle this issue of immigration, especially with the new policies coming out pretty much on a regular basis now?
Andrea, I'll let the journalist probably tackle this one to begin with.
Okay, sure. I mean, immigration, especially right now, is something that's going to touch so many people. It is hard, I think, at this point, to exist in a bubble in which you don't know somebody who has immigrated in any sort of way to this country, and then for high schoolers, I think being the child of, in particular, undocumented immigrants is so common. I mean, and in California, I don't know how you would escape that reality. So I think it's something that is touching the lives of students in various high schools, and probably almost every high school in California. And so like just for that matter, just as a for the purpose of covering the community, even in a hyper local community like a high school, I think it's important to make sure that those students are like at least being offered the chance to to share their stories and to speak for themselves. The other thing I would say is that for me personally, like growing up, I did not even consider that like I could cover my own community in any way. And so to start that off in high school, I think is really huge and really empowering for future journalists.
And I will just, echo, much of what Andrea said. I mean, I've talked with some folks on the legal hotline where they said, 20% of their school is not showing up. They're not showing up to classes. They're not showing up to practices. I mean, this has had a direct impact on many, many schools. It has a direct impact on all of us. And as I tell students, your job as a journalist really is to determine what's newsworthy. What do you think is of value to talk to your readers about. And once you've made that decision, I mean, that's your job, to back off and to not cover it because you're afraid. Hopefully, resources like this where we can kind of give you a little bit of information that hopefully reduces some of that fear, that provides a bit more, maybe some, shields or some defenses or things like that that you can point to, will help you out in that. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is one of the biggest issues of the day. And yeah, certainly right after Trump's policy, that the Trump policy was enacted, we started getting lots and lots of phone calls. I mean, in the days and the weeks after, many phone calls from more from high school student journalists, honestly, than college student journalists, who really wanted to know what could they do. Could they run articles, know your rights sorts of articles? Could they tell the personal stories of the impact of this new policy? And so, it's very much, yeah, they're very interested in the topic, and I think that's all that's necessary to go forward with it. I mean, you want to be mindful about the sorts of things you are covering. I mean, you probably don't want to write a story that said, I was taken to this, undisclosed secret location where, undocumented immigrants are holding up. You don't want to, provide, give them reason to come after you. But certainly just telling the story in very human terms, I think, is very important right now.
Can I add something to that really quickly?
Yes.
Yeah, so I wanted to also include the idea that the story that I ended up writing was not just spurred by the Trump administration, even though that was kind of what started the discourse. The decision to write the story on my part and with my co-writer was our district had done something very specific, which is to send out an email in support of and sending out these resources for undocumented families in our district. And going off of that, we see this is something that our district has taken a stance on. This is something our governor has taken a stance on, providing various resources to the undocumented community, even on the governor's website. And this is something that is real and happening within our schools. And from there, that's the kind of the angle in which we tackled it, rather than just kind of stating our own stance on it, even if me and my co-writer do have our own political values and do have our own perspective on it, but really going from that news angle, like here's what reality looks like, here's what people are doing and saying about this issue, and then going off of that information to build, and here's how it's impacting real people in our community, and here's like the real people who are actually going through this on a day-to-day basis. And that's kind of how we got it to a know your rights story, even though it started off with a very newsy, oh, there was an email sent, there was a resolution signed by our board, that. And so I think that made it a lot more comfortable for student reporters, that angle, where we're not asking you to take a hard stance that might potentially, like, that can kind of feel really scary, right? To say, oh, I'm completely against this. But it's more of, here's what's happening, here's the reality of it, and let's work from there. Let's see what people have to say about it, and then we can tell our story in that manner.
So we really want to hit kind of the ethical reporting standards. And I'm going to start with Andrea on that. And then I want to transition into more of the legal considerations that Mike is an expert at, because I think both are super important. I think students and advisors can be very fearful about some of the consequences of this type of reporting. And so go ahead, Andrea. Would you start, like, when you go if you were going to a story like this, what are the questions you're asking yourself, the ethical questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always start from a place of not wanting to do any harm. And so the first Trump administration, 2017, I think it was difficult at first to convince editors that somebody should be anonymized in some way, like whether it's just using a first name or initials. I can't really use a pseudonym. That's just the LA Times style, but other outlets do allow for pseudonyms. So long story short, this time around, I mean, it became very clear at some point that people were not going to be willing to talk to us unless we could provide them with some level of protection. And it's like, who would? I wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't talk to somebody if I was in a place where I feared for my life and feared for being, returned to my country of origin, unless that they could guarantee me some level of protection. And so I start with that. I mean, I'm not going to make the decision for someone. So for instance, recently I spoke to a woman from Venezuela who's an asylum seeker, who is a staunch opposition to the government in Venezuela, has been very public about it, was very public about it when she lived there, obviously has like a solid legal basis for asylum here, based on her, political persecution by the government in Venezuela. Anyway, she wanted to be named. She said, no, the Venezuelan government already knows me. They know who I am. They have pictures of me. They sought, they sought me when I was there, and that's why I'm here now. And so for me, it doesn't make a difference whether I, use my full name or not. And so I laid it all out for her. I said, like, this choice is up to you. And she said, I want to use my full name. So, I think we empower people to do what they feel is best for them. But just today, I talked to another Venezuelan couple also, fearing political persecution in Venezuela. They did not want their names used. So I used their middle names. So I think that's a conversation that you kind of have to tailor to the individual. I give them the option, because I think, like, we can't, as journalists, we can't sort of like fool ourselves into thinking like we're really giving people the chance to tell their own stories fully, because as journalists, we have, we're not going to give them the end product to read before we publish it. That's not something that we do. But we can give them as much control as is reasonable within, the ethics of being a journalist. And for me, that means like allowing them to, tell me what they are comfortable and not comfortable with, and for me to respect that.
Go ahead, Mike. So actually, one of the things I think people are afraid of, what can I be asked? How can I be held accountable? I think teachers have that fear. I think students have that fear. I know, Andrea, if the government were to go after you, you'd end up possibly with a contempt of court citation. But we have a long history of journalists standing up to that, and the LA Times has some pretty good lawyers. It's a little different, I think, from teachers and students. So, Mike, the more you can talk about that, I think that'd be very useful, because I think that's often the greatest fear. Hopefully, the greatest fear is not harming the people you're interviewing, and then the fear for yourself.
Yeah, you bet. So, after the policy went into effect in January, the two big issues that we started hearing about, one was absolutely confidentiality, and how do we keep our sources safe? How do we keep our advisor safe? And things like that. We can talk about that in a second too. But also censorship. Do we have the right to cover these stories? Do we have the right to do a know your rights sort of thing in our student newspaper? As far as the confidentiality piece goes, I mean, I love Andrea's suggestion of having that informal, that initial sit down, just where you explain what you're looking to do, who you are, what the ramifications of all this might be. It just is such an important conversation to have. The other thing, though, I mean, before you have that conversation, before you even have that conversation, it's really important, I think, just to think about, as a student journalist, whether I really want to get into this, whether I'm really willing to make promises of confidentiality. I mean, one of the things with the promise of confidentiality is, as you mentioned earlier, Mitch, I mean, journalists go to jail to protect their sources. They go to jail to protect their unpublished information. And as I'll talk about in just a second, the legal protections that are available, specifically in the context of ICE raids, are a bit questionable, or can be a bit questionable right now. And so it's not guaranteed, that the law is necessarily going to back you up. And so, if you are, you need to think about initially, am I prepared to, keep this promise? If I'm going to make this promise, am I prepared to keep it no matter what? I mean, if the shield laws that we'll talk about in a second don't kick in, and other sorts of protections don't kick in, am I prepared to go to jail? Am I prepared to face the consequences? And I think if the answer to that question is no, or I'm not sure, I think you need to back off and not even think about, making that promise of confidentiality. But once you've gotten past that internal sort of conversation with yourself, yeah, having a sit down with the source is absolutely critical. I mean, one of the things that folks don't often know is that, when you when you promise a source, for example, their conversation is going to be off the record or on deep background or something like that. None of those terms actually have, legal definitions. It is really important that you and your source, have an understanding, a clear understanding of what off the record means. Does that mean, I can't use you, if I can't name you? Does it mean I can't use you for anything other than the information you're providing? Whatever it is, whatever the terms are, you need to figure that out. Um, Once you have that down, though, the concerns that we have are, if ICE decides that they need to come after you to get more information. Couple things initially, though, you never, as a journalist, you do not have to voluntarily cooperate with ICE. You do not have to voluntarily, turn anything over to law enforcement officials, or even to school officials. I mean, they have to have some legal basis for requiring you to turn over your information. I actually think it's going to be difficult for ICE to obtain a subpoena to go after a high school student journalist to turn over their sources, depending on the story they write. If it's just a story about, the impact that all of this policy is having on students, that's not the sort of information that I think most judges are going to say is critical to the ICE enforcement action. I mean, keep in mind, really important to remember, there is absolutely nothing illegal about student journalists talking to undocumented students. That is, that's part of what journalists do. We just talk to students. There's nothing illegal about that. And so, ICE would have to, typically you issue a subpoena when there's been some form of, illegal conduct, some sort of illegal action. And it's going to, the information that you have as a journalist is going to somehow, help law enforcement officials do their work. I just don't see how you get to that in most of the stories involving students. But assuming that they do issue a subpoena, typically the way that we fight back as a journalist is we look to either state shield laws or what we call the reporter's privilege, something that's recognized under the First Amendment. Most states in the country, not every state, but most states in the country now have a state shield law. A state shield law, again, is specifically designed to help reporters protect their confidential sources and information. In most states, the Shield Law does cover student journalists as well as professional or commercial press, but not in every state. In some states, the language of the Shield Law is tied to actually working for, being employed by news organizations, and obviously, student journalists typically we aren't paid, we're not employed by, and so sometimes we can have problems with that. So most states in the country do have a state shield law. The problem that we have here is that ICE is a federal agency. And so more than likely, these cases are probably going to be prosecuted, would be prosecuted in a federal court. There is no federal shield law yet at this point. And so what we would be looking at is, how each of the different federal circuits in the country have treated this thing we call the reporter's privilege, which is not a statute, but it's kind of recognized by First Amendment case law. It does the same thing as a shield law, but it just comes about in a different way. The problem with the reporter's privilege, though, in each of the federal circuits, is that not every federal circuit has recognized it. So if you are in, I just took a quick peek, I'll just read them out. If you're in Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, or North Dakota or South Dakota, if you're in any of those states, you are in a state where the federal appeals court has not recognized a reporter's privilege. If you're in any of the other states, there is some privilege that may be available to you. So I guess, and we can, if you are subpoenaed, obviously, you need to reach out very quickly, call us, call, your media law uncle, friend, or whatever, but you need to get legal help really quickly, and we can kind of sort some of that stuff out. Again, I just don't think for the most part that's going to be something we have to worry too much about. I think the more the more dangerous or risky thing is the fact that student journalists, for example, very often use school resources to produce their work. They are they're typing up their stories on a school account. Maybe it goes up to the school cloud or something like that. The problem with that is that school officials very often often have access to that information, or they can have access to that information. And so if you are talking to an undocumented source, if you're talking to somebody whose identity you absolutely have to keep secret, it's so important that you not use school resources to document any of that stuff. You don't want to write down sources' names, any other information. You don't want to use school email to send that information around to your colleagues. Just stay completely outside of the school, because one of the problem would be if ICE shows up, they might not even need to get a subpoena if they can convince school officials that, hey, I just need to look at your, can you get into your computer accounts and tell us what you find there. So really important, stay completely outside of school resources if you're doing this sort of reporting. The other thing is the advisors. I mean, advisors are school employees, and advisors, advisors and student journalists often have a very special bond, very special relationship. But at the end of the day, they are employees, and sometimes employees have to do things that employees don't want to do. And so if the principal says, hey, ICE has contacted us and we need you to go through the school, the journalism account to see what you find, that advisor is going to be put in a very difficult position of either doing what they're told or being charged with insubordination and have their job threatened. So you're not using school resources to store your information. You're definitely not telling your advisor who your confidential sources are. For an advisor, ignorance is bliss. It really is one of those things. You don't want to put your advisor in that bad situation.
And Mike,
Can I stop right there?
someone put a question in the chat. What about college journalists? Do those same rules apply for them? Or are they a bit more different? Just because in colleges also sometimes they're kind of more self-sufficient as opposed to at the high school level.
Yeah, no, I think in a lot of the same stuff applies. I mean, the same things as far as application of shield laws and reporters' privilege and stuff. That's going to be the same for college reporters. Very often, college reporters don't have the same sort of they don't use the same school resources. They're used in a different sort of way. So if you have an outside Google account that's storing your stuff, as some college student media do, as opposed to using school accounts, you're probably okay on that. But yeah, pretty much the same sorts of confidentiality rules would apply to college media.
A couple things I would add to that. When we're talking about, like storing things outside of school, I think that's really important. When I talk to sources who are, concerned about privacy and safety, I talk to them on end-to-end encrypted platforms. So Signal, WhatsApp are the main two. Honestly, I don't even really rely on my, or I'm starting not to rely on my Google account because Google has had hacking issues. So Proton Drive is something that I'm currently looking at. I haven't made the switch yet, but I'm very heavily considering it, or just downloading Microsoft Word and storing things on like an external hard drive if they're extremely sensitive. That might be a little bit beyond. But then the other thing that I would say is, a lot of immigrants, especially the people who came for the last several years, are people who have some sort of provisional status. So TPS, DACA, those sorts of things where they are registered with the government already. And so for me, oftentimes the fear or the concern is not protecting them from the government, because the government could has their information and does not need to rely on me, or should not need to rely on me, even if they wanted to. The concern is if they get deported, what awaits them back in their home country.
Yeah, good point. The encrypted media, or encrypted signal, and those things, absolutely so important there. Any other questions? Did we kind of cover the confidentiality questions? Because I was going to say the other reason that people were contacting me is censorship, which is, why unfortunately high school student journalists in particular have contacted us for, 50 years. And, pretty much the same sort of censorship rules would apply to students, covering this topic as would apply to covering other sorts of topics. The very first question I usually will ask is, where are you calling from? Luckily, if you are in California, you have some really great legal protection out there in terms of, California New Voices laws. 17 other states have those similar sort of protections available. And in those states, there really is probably, yeah, you're in great shape. I mean, there's really not a whole lot school officials can probably do about your covering, one of the hottest topics that's out there right now, news topics that's out there. If you're one of the other states, though, it gets a little dicey, as it always has. We need to look at, local student media policies and things like that. I mean, the Supreme Court in 1988 with its Hazelwood case just made such a horrible mess of the law, for most student journalists. And so there is a process. So call me up and we'll go through the process just to figure out what sort of legal protections you have. But again, my advice to most students when they call is, hey, your job as a journalist is to determine, what's newsworthy, what's worth reporting, and then just do the best journalism you can. If school officials are going to censor it, there are lots of different ways of getting that information out there in 2025. So yeah, I will say for college student media, hopefully, college student journalists know they have significantly more legal protection, at least at the public college level. Basically, you have the same sorts of protections as members of the professional press. So you're free to cover these topics, as you wish.
Okay, so another question for Andrea, and actually anybody, but you are the working reporter in here. Actually, you and Kathryn, because I shouldn't slight Kathryn's work in any way. And those of you who know Monta Vista High School journalism program, it's absolutely superb. What are some stories that you think students should be pursuing besides, because obviously students naturally want to read sort of profiles of people going through terrible situations, but what are some other things? And also, let's just start with that. There might be some follow-up.
Yeah, I had a few thoughts. I mean, one that pops out most immediately is how student activists are reacting to the news of the former Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil's arrest. I wonder, is that emboldening high school students who are already active, or is it spreading fear? Maybe a little bit of both. I mean, that could be a really not easy, but like a really immediate follow to this whole storyline about Khalil's arrest.
That's such an important development. I mean, legally, I mean, that's such a big deal what's going on out there. So yeah, I echo that.
Huge. Yeah. Somebody mentioned explainers. I mean, explainers and like the how-tos and those sorts of stories are really important. Like what happens when someone's detained? What are your rights when ICE knocks on your door? What is a temporary status? Like what is TPS? What's going on with DACA? Should students who filed a FAFSA and have undocumented parents be worried? Those are all like very public service journalism stories, many of which, my own paper has covered, or I personally have covered, that I think are like very, very relevant right now. And then like, what are schools doing to help immigrant families? I mean, are they having Know Your Rights sessions? Are they passing out red cards, which are little, cards that tell people what their rights are in the event of an ICE arrest? Are they, helping families develop family plans? Interviewing a family as they sort of have those very real, very raw discussions, I think is something that, that could be a really good story.
Okay. And where are some organizations, or where can students find some of the data that's reliable on immigrants, or just learn what is DACA? Where are some organizations or websites that they can go and get some information so they can get obviously reliable information, other than just like most of my kids, they get their news from social media. And I tell them not everything there is totally accurate. So you got to, check your sources. But what are some places that my student journalists and others can go to and get information that they can definitely use in their stories?
I would encourage them to look up immigrant and like reporting on immigration and look at who's quoted. Like, let them do their research. I mean, there are so many organizations that I rely on that are, really great. And I try to, vary it in my work, but there is honestly so much good information. There are so many organizations that are actually reliable, that can help students, that I think like truly just doing a search of like 5 different stories on whatever topic they're covering is going to get them like some pretty solid sources that they could follow up with. When it comes to data, one place that I rely on a lot is an organization called Track Reports. They put out they basically spend all of their time FOIAing the federal government for data on immigration, on ICE arrests, on, you know, the status of detention facilities, all this really, really good information that honestly is not found anywhere else. Track Reports is amazing. Customs and Border Protection, they release monthly statistics on arrivals at the border. So up until recently, that was like a very, you know, newsworthy and interesting topic. Now the arrivals at the border are pretty, you know, they're pretty few and far between. So, I mean, that's interesting in its own right. What else? There are Migration Policy Institute is one that I rely on a lot. They put out they're like, as far as organizations go, a lot of them on immigration can be sort of, you know, like quote unquote partisan. This one is very nonpartisan. Some of their leaders used to work within DHS. So they are like very much about the information. So MPI is an organization I rely on a lot. I was thinking about like local data and where students can get, you know, information about like on the school level. And somebody mentioned attendance numbers. I think it was Mike, right? Like attendance numbers are huge. Like I would be so curious what the attendance numbers were at a particular school, like before and after there was a publicly discussed immigration raid. Like in LA, you know, a few weeks ago when there were those immigration raids, you know, what were the attendances like at certain schools? Before and after Trump's inauguration. I mean, those are things that you could look up at the school level that hopefully they would give to you.
And if they don't, I will just plug. We
That's it.
actually have an automated Freedom of Information letter generator, so you can submit an open records request to your school. That's kind of statistical information should all be bread and butter public record. So if they don't provide that to you voluntarily, hopefully they will. Ask them for it nicely. If they don't, you can definitely submit open records request for it.
Love that.
I bet Josh is going to put in our little open records generator there in the chat. Thanks, Josh.
I just want to add to that because often during my career, you know, school officials might just ignore the student request. Sometimes I'd follow up, and if it really got hairy, there's no way they would say no to like the student's parent. But the FOIA request is a very useful tool. Anything that's done publicly on a school computer is accessible by reporters, I believe. Correct? If you put in the proper FOIA request. So you can get the data. Fortunately, you know, I cultivated relationships at my school, so I could always get that information. The attendance office didn't really care. They just gave us whatever we asked for. And got some really interesting things over the years.
Oh, I wonder what like school leaders are emailing to I mean, if they're having email conversations about Khalil's arrest, what are those conversations like?
Actually, Andrea, I obviously you've submitted requests for emails and things like that. What's the sort of the time frame for a request and actually getting the information? Is there one?
It really depends by jurisdiction. I would say that local Public Records Act requests are much quicker to be fulfilled than, I mean, FOIA, basically, unless you have a lawyer to back you up, I don't necessarily expect FOIAs to be, like federal government FOIAs to be, you know, answered in a timely manner, if at all. For local public records, yeah, it really depends on the jurisdiction. For me, what's been, you know, really crucial is finding out who is the like keeper of the records. Who do I call to actually like bug? And I try to find a name and a phone number, and then I just like call them once a week. And I become their worst enemy, and eventually they break down and they give me what I was looking for, which is amazing.
And there was a question in the chat also for, in terms of Public Records Act requests, is it mostly for public schools, or can private schools also, or students at private schools also request the public records from their school, like attendance records, if it's a private school? How does that work?
Yeah, the public records law is not going to work at a private school, so it would mainly just be, yeah, asking nicely.
Okay, all right. And I think we're gonna start opening it up, I guess, maybe for questions now. We got about maybe 13 minutes left. And there were some people who submitted questions when they registered. So we're gonna ask those first. Um, let me see. And the first one was, other than the judicial warrant, can agencies use other ways to get a student or get to a student? So other
Yeah.
than judicial warrant, can agencies use other ways to get to a student?
I guess I can take that one, and I will just preface this with I am neither an immigration attorney or a criminal attorney, so I'm not probably the best source for this. But yeah, I mean, my understanding is that yeah, the ICE does not need a judge signed order. They can actually get like an administrative warrant. Some of the other sorts of there are rules in criminal law that if they see some sort of activity, illegal activity taking place, or if somebody's running away or something like that. I mean, giving them reason to actually make arrests, they can do that if it's in kind of plain sight. So there are some ways beyond, yeah, a judge's order to try and get some of this information. Oh, Adriana, I think you're muted.
Sorry. How can student journalists writing about undocumented immigrants keep their digital notes safe from ICE at all? So I think we kind of already touched that. Don't use your school resources. Let me see what's another one. Oh, this is a good one. How are Trump administration's anti-immigrant policies affecting the college application process? That's also a good story to look into.
I don't, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know, Andrea, if you've dug into
That's
that at
not
all.
something that I've done reporting on, but yeah, it is something. I mean, a colleague has written about, for instance, what I mentioned earlier, like the FAFSA process and how, students with undocumented parents are navigating that, like whether they even apply for financial aid, given that that's, a place where their parents could be identified as undocumented if they don't have a social security number. So I think it's like absolutely affecting the college admissions process and application process. And that's a story idea.
Kathryn, have you seen that at your school at all?
It isn't it isn't explicitly like legally like, oh, because of this undocumented policy, you cannot apply to certain colleges. It's more something that made me think of was the source that I interviewed for my story. She kind of touched on how she had gotten into college and she was under the DACA status and then eventually moved across the country for college. And then the first Trump administration came in. And at that point, she actually quit college entirely to move back and make sure the rest of her family, which at the time was undocumented, was safe. And so I feel like when it comes to affecting the college application process, I'm not exactly sure the like tangible impacts, but I know that there's definitely a lot of like familial and a lot of tension surrounding college and being able to leave the country, not leave the country, leave your community, leave the places that you are, your family, in order to go pursue a higher education.
Yeah, Andrea, who was your colleague who wrote about FAFSA?
His name's Javed Kaleem. He covers education. He's on our education team.
Okay, I have the web. I actually apparently spelled it correctly. Kalim.
No, sorry, Jaweed.
Oh
And then
wow.
phonetically it's like Jaweed, and his last name is Kaleem, Kaleem.
Okay. And then obviously everything at the LA Times is firewalled.
Right. Happy to, if you have any, particular stories that you're wanting to get a PDF of, I'm happy to make that for you and email it to you.
Okay, that would be helpful.
Also, the school libraries, they have a lot of programs, and I forget now which one my school uses or my school district, but students can get access to articles, without having a subscription to a publication. So if they have
That's
maybe a
true.
name or the headline, they have that. So maybe contact also your school librarian, which they're always helpful to help, students find articles or any other.
And if I'm remembering correctly, I thought that the LA Public Library, I don't know about other public libraries, but I thought the LA Public Library offered free subscriptions to the New York Times.
Probably as well. All right, and then someone else had another question. How do we balance providing information for student support on campus while not outing these places for federal attack?
So I will just say that I was talking to a school in the DC area, and they had a number of students that were impacted by this policy. And one of their concerns was, do we even want to bring attention to this by writing about it in the school newspaper, and perhaps upsetting some community members or something that would call ICE and tell them to come to our school. I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole in terms of just what if. Again, I think the main thing, your job is to determine what the news is and to cover it. Again, being mindful, you don't want to be mindful of what you're writing. You don't want to put information in that's going to put a target on your back or your source's back. But I think providing just some basic information about what's going on, that's I don't think we want it. Now's not the time for fear. I mean, when we start self-censoring in anticipation of what might happen, what federal agents might do, I think we've already lost. So I think you determine what the news is and you cover it.
I would also say it's up to those, when it's a student organization, student led, maybe that's a different story, but certainly like organizations that are led by adults, I think they can make the determination about, how public they want to be. And, you can inquire about a story and they can respond or not. When it's student led organizations, I think, Mike, what you said earlier about like, you just don't out where they're at. You're not going to write what room they meet in and what time and day of the week. But I think naming that an organization exists, or like a student group on campus, that is not enough information for anyone to go off of. Then you start talking about like, who are you naming individually and that sort of thing.
Can I also speak on really quickly something that Mike said? A continuing conversation within our publication has been, especially with the current political climate around journalism itself, whether it be Jeff Bezos coming out and kind of had that statement about the Washington Post recently, but also the AP being kicked out of government like meetings because they refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. So these things are currently happening where there's censorship even within like larger publications. So the idea that we were kind of talking within our publication about was what our responsibility becomes bigger when they can't fill their responsibility, and we need to decide like, hey, these are the issues that matter to us, whether it be immigration, but also other issues, and really we can't censor ourselves too in a time where there's so much censorship already happening. That's why I also made the decision to write these articles and why our publication writes many articles like this, because I've been taught very much the power of journalism, and that although it can be intimidating, it's like educational. I was able to share these resources that other people may be able to access and maybe gain more information from. And I think if you are on the fence about covering these issues at your school, that this is a time for empowerment of student journalism, especially as these larger outlets are not necessarily have as much access or have as much credibility as they have in the past. So it's just something to keep in mind.
I love that so much. And I think we could go down a whole rabbit hole about billionaire-owned newspapers, but here we are.
Yes. All right, we have a question from Sitlali. Where is a good place to identify misinformation on immigration topics?
I think there are, well, okay, for me personally, I follow a few people who are really knowledgeable, like on Twitter, and they are often X, and they are often writing about like especially when something is misinformation, correcting the record. There's the American Immigration Council, this like very, very knowledgeable lawyer, Aaron Reichlin Melnick, who I follow. There's WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. They have a few people there who are like extremely knowledgeable on border issues, and they're often correcting the record. There's PolitiFact, they're often doing stories on immigration and correcting the record there. Does Snopes exist anymore? They might not exist anymore, but hopefully they do. There are like entire news organizations that are built around, correcting misinformation on immigration topics. So between that and like some of the expert organizations, that like Migration Policy Institute and all those places that I mentioned, that's pretty much where I rely on.
All right, someone asked a question about language. Like, should we use for undocumented immigrants? I put in the chat a link from the National Association of Spanish Journalists. They put out a guide a couple months ago, kind of explaining cultural competency and words to use, and how to portray undocumented immigrants correctly. So it's definitely a great resource to have. And I know I shared it with the Journalism Education Association listserv when advisors started first asking questions. So definitely that's a good source for the National Association of Spanish Journalists Guide. I am also a former board member of NHJ, but definitely they're a great resource as well.
That's a great plug. I would say for my stories and for the LA Times style on undocumented immigrants and language, yeah, we definitely do not use illegal, undocumented, unauthorized sometimes, although that's a little bit like legalese, like people who lack legal status. You can say somebody who like crossed the border illegally or like entered the country illegally, as long as you're not calling them, the individual, illegal. For me, I like to just, I think the best case scenario is to just explain like what the person's individual situation is. Often, like I said, if somebody has TPS, maybe they entered without legal status or without authorization, but now they have this temporary form of legal status, and so it's always best to just like explain the entirety of their situation, and sometimes you can't, and so for those situations I will use undocumented.
I see Josh just put into the chat our new guide, fresh off the press today. So on talks about some of the things we mentioned today.
Oh, great. Great resource. Right. And are there any other questions or any other comments or any last words from our panelists?
I have one little thing. For me, the starting off point was immigration, but let's remember that everything we discussed today can apply to any kind of story that you're writing. This is simply about good journalism. Immigration is such an important issue right now, but there's the more general as well, which is why I thought it was so important to do this webinar. All right, I think that's probably about it. Some of you are probably ready. Some of you probably already had dinner. I can't. Both of us in LA are probably thinking about it. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Josh, behind the scenes, you're amazing. Thank you so much. Andrea, thank you for your time. It's really appreciated. And Kathryn, I wish I had a classroom full of you when I was teaching.
Yes. And Josh, someone asked if we can add the links since I guess they're not able to save them from the chat.
Yes, I will do my best to collect all the links and put those in the email that you will get tomorrow, along with the recording of this conversation.
Perfect. Thank you.
I have links as well that I am happy to send along.
Thank
That'd
you.
be great because I want to post, to the listserv and to at least everyone in California, all the specifics on this so they could definitely view this and get all the information. So
Okay.
excellent.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Kathryn, Andrea, Mike, and definitely Josh for helping us on the back end of putting this together. Thank you for your help. And thank you for everyone who joined us. Hopefully you got some good insight that you can share back with your students or your classmates. I know we had a lot of students, which was very impressive. I like that we had students involved as well. So that's very awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.